Hello, my name is Jared Ludlow, Publications Director at the BYU Religious Studies Center, your weekly resource for gospel scholarship. Today, I'd like to share some possible resources that can accompany your Come Follow Me reading for Acts chapters 16 through 21, July 24th through 30th. The first one is called Paul as a Witness of the Work of God. It's by Ted Gibbons, an Institute teacher, and it comes from a Sperry Symposium volume. And in this, he talks about Paul's ministry that was motivated by his testimony of Christ and his determination to be a witness of him at all times, in all things, and in all places. So that famous line from a Book of Mormon scripture is how he structures his article to talk about how Paul at all times stood as a witness, some of the things that he witnessed about, and then all the different places that he went as he bore his witness. And he points out a few interesting things about Paul's ministry, one of them being that the Lord warned his disciples that even their longing for personal safety must not cause them to shut their mouths in fear. And no such admonition was necessary for Paul. He never sought a safer environment on his own, but at least 8 times in the book of Acts, when Paul was in danger, the disciples tried to move him out of harm's way, so he never shunned bearing witness, even if it could potentially cause harm. And when Paul couldn't share personal conversation, he wrote letters, and so we're very grateful for these letters that he wrote because now they form an important part of our New Testament. Paul certainly delivered his witness through his actions, his example, his obedience, and his message. As I mentioned, the author goes through and explains that the times and things and places that Paul witnesses. And then he ends talking about how Paul was a witness of God even unto death, and concludes with this thought. Paul's witness of God at all times and in all things and in all places does not end with his death. That witness has echoed down the ages. The second article is called The Western Text of the Book of Acts. It's by J. Philip Shaling, also an Institute instructor, and it comes from a volume published by the RSC called Apocryphal Writings and the Latter-day Saints. And he talks about how in the ancient world, often we only have very few copies of ancient manuscripts. But in the case of the New Testament, we have approximately 5,000 Greek manuscripts of all or part of the New Testament. So this gives us a lot of material with which we can compare among the different manuscripts. And one point he makes early on is that the unity as well as the diversity of these manuscripts is staggering. They basically all tell the same story, to the extent that one biblical scholar tells us no fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed reading. But on the other hand, no 2 of the 5,000 New Testament manuscripts agree exactly in all particulars. So the problem for biblical scholars today is to decide which of the many available variants most closely represents the original. And he goes on and he talks about, and gets into kind of biblical scholarship here, but that there's 4 basic families of manuscripts that these different manuscripts can be categorized into. There's the Alexandrian, the Caesarean, the Western, and the Byzantine. And those titles, basically deal with geographical locations. The Western and the Alexandrian have the most early witnesses or manuscripts to the New Testament time period. So comparing those two, particularly in the book of Acts, we see that the Western text is about 10% longer than the Alexandrian text. And so then he goes through and explains some of the major differences between them, whether it's exaggerating the emphasis or putting in religious formulae, substituting simple names of Christ for more of a theological title. These kinds of things were developed among some of the Western text manuscripts. He also talks about and compares some certain episodes, like the increased prominence of Peter in some of the episodes, the marital status of the apostles and the unity of the early church, whether they were more pro-Gentile or anti-Jew, their relationship or discussion about women. And so through this, he's able to see how we start seeing the development of different Christian thought in some of these categories, and maybe even some evidence of apostasy creeping in among some of these manuscripts. And so, to kind of conclude, he says the Western text reflects a group of people who are increasing in their tendency to adopt formality and ritual in the use of names and titles. The group appears to feel very strongly about the infallibility of Peter as the leader of the group and tends to idealize the unity with which they felt existed in the earlier church. The Western text seems to imply that this group consists mainly of Gentiles who are experiencing a slight bias against the Jews, as well as exhibiting a tendency to depreciate the role and worth of women in the church and society. The Western text also seems to reflect a growing ambivalence as to the nature of Christ, which, as we see in Christian history, really picked up with the councils and creeds that developed later on.